right, good morning. We are in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, just beginning. Finished up chapter 11 last week as Paul was continuing to defend himself, defend his apostleship, defend who he, or the teachings that he had given while he was there, as many people had been drifting away, going back into the old law, as teachers had come into Corinth and were teaching them to do so, and making accusations against Paul. And that's been a theme for a little while now. Paul has been having to defend himself and defend that he was truly an apostle, as accusations have been made against him. And in the last chapter, part of his defense had been some of the sufferings that he had been through. And we discussed some of those things, how Paul had faced many trials and difficulties and sufferings in life, and not just in life, but as a result, he faced those things as a result of what? Well, his preaching, his teaching of Jesus Christ. If he were not truly who he claimed to be as an apostle, and if Christ hadn't brought the old covenant to a conclusion and brought in the church, why would Paul have suffered all that? It doesn't make any sense for these accusations against Paul. He really was who he claimed to be, and Jesus was who Paul preached him to be. And Paul had suffered greatly in that preaching of Jesus. We go into chapter 12. Let's begin reading. Let's read the first 5 verses, and we'll go from there. 2 Corinthians 12, beginning at verse 1. It is not expedient for me, doubtless, to glory. I will come to visions and revelations of the Lord. I knew a man in Christ above 14 years ago, whether in the body I cannot tell, or whether out of the body I cannot tell. God knoweth. Such an one called up to the third heaven. And I knew such a man, whether in the body or out of the body I cannot tell. God knoweth. How that he was caught up into paradise, and heard unspeakable words, which is not lawful for a man to utter. Of such an one I will glory. Yet of myself I will not glory, but in mine infirmities. All right, we'll back up to the beginning now, back to verse 1 here in chapter 12. King James says, it is not expedient for me, doubtless, to glory. Now, in the way we use terminology, the way we speak, that phrase is difficult. So I think it's helpful for us to look at how other translations are written, because what Paul is saying here is that Paul doesn't want to glory and boast, but it's necessary because of the situation that he finds himself in. He doesn't want to, he doesn't like doing it, but it's necessary. And that's more clear when you compare other translations. For example, the ESV says, I must go on boasting, though there is nothing to be gained by it. In other words, I don't want to do this. It's not profitable really for me, but I need to do it because of what's happening. The New American Standard says, boasting is necessary, though it's not beneficial. The American Standard says, I must needs glory, though it is not expedient. So what Paul is saying, I don't want to do this. It's not serving for me personally. I don't want to lift myself up. That's not what I'm trying to do. But because of the circumstances, I need to continue to remind you who I am, that I truly am an apostle, that I truly am preaching Jesus Christ. Now, at the end of that verse 1, he says, I will come to visions and revelations of the Lord. Now, he'd been defending himself. He'd been giving evidence that he really was who he said he was, but now he's entering into a different type of evidence, and he specifically says, visions and revelations. Now, Paul's an inspired apostle, so the Lord had revealed certain things to him that not everybody's been privy to. So he's going to describe some of that, but not go into detail, but go into and describe some of those things. Questions, comments about verse 1? Verse 2, he goes into some of what he just mentioned. He said, I will come to visions and revelations of the Lord. So, he says, I knew a man in Christ above 14 years ago. And whether in the body I cannot tell, whether out of the body I cannot tell, God knoweth. Okay, let's talk about that phrase, or that first part for a moment. I knew a man in Christ. First of all, what does it mean when he says, I knew a man in Christ? He's a Christian. Yeah, pretty straightforward, pretty simple there. He's talking about someone who was a follower of Jesus Christ, and he knew this man. All right, well, who is this man Paul's talking about? Well, Paul doesn't specifically say. However, most Bible students will say that Paul's talking about himself right here. He's using the third person, saying, I knew a man. But most Bible students will say, it looks like Paul's talking about himself. And I tend to agree with that. It looks like Paul's talking about himself, but speaking in the third person, as you would talk about another person. Why, if that's the case, why would Paul talk about it this way? If he's talking about himself, why would he use the third person as if it's somebody else? I think that's a big part of it. He can't fully comprehend what happened, and he even says that. I don't even, in the body or out of the body, I don't know. He doesn't fully understand what happened. So maybe that has something to do with it. I also wonder if it's because of what he's said multiple times, including the previous verse, that he doesn't like, lifting himself up as if, he's not greater than everybody else, but he's been blessed to have a relationship with the Lord that is different from other people. So maybe that has something to do with it too. He doesn't want to, out of a desire not to boast himself. He's still talking about himself, but talking about himself in third person. Maybe that has something to do with it as well. I'm not sure. But I do tend to agree with the general idea that he looks like he's referring to himself here. He's the man that he knew 14 years ago, and he's describing here. What other thoughts, questions do you have? Good question. We'll get to that in just a minute. Good question. But first he says, above 14 years ago. All right, he knew this man, probably Paul himself. He's referring to himself 14 years ago. Now, let's get some time here. I think we've talked about the date of the writing, the estimated date anyway, of when Paul wrote this. This letter of 2 Corinthians would have been mid to late 50s, somewhere in that range. Give or take a few years, mid to late 50s. Okay, this is 14 years prior to that. What time are we looking at? Would be early to mid 40s, depending on when in the 50s it was. You're looking at, if it's mid to late 50s, 14 years prior would be early to mid 40s. Okay? So we'll reference that again in just a minute as well. So that's the time period. In that time period, early to mid 40s, that would have been around the time of Paul's first missionary journey. So that may be significant to this as well. So this, if it is Paul that he's talking about, tend to think it is, this looks like it would have been taking place around the time of his first missionary journey. All right, keep that in mind. Now he says, whether in the body I cannot tell, whether out of the body I cannot tell, God knows. Paul knew the event. He knew something about what happened. He knew the man, probably himself, but he's speaking in third person, but he did not know the details. And specifically, one detail he didn't know, he said, I don't know if I was actually in the body, if this was an out-of-body experience. I don't know what happened. Some might ask, well, what would be the difference between in the body and out of the body in this revelation, this vision, whatever it is that what's happening with Paul here? Well, someone might say, well, was this like what happened with Enoch or Elijah? What did God do with Enoch and Elijah? Yeah, he just took them, right? They were there on the earth, and then they took them. They were gone from the earth. So was this like what happened with them, but then the Lord sent him back? I don't know. Paul didn't know either. Or if that would have been an in-body, because Enoch and Elijah were just taken, it appears. But what would be the out of body, if it was out of body. A spirit. Now, if you have a spirit that is out of the body, what does that mean? What does that mean for the body? That's death. So maybe this could have been Paul died, but then was sent back. And that's an interesting thing to think about as well. But Paul doesn't even know if that's what happened. It doesn't eat, so we don't know for sure either. But I bring that up because it reminds me also of something that Paul referenced last chapter, and we talked about Paul referenced being stoned. Well, when do we know that he was stoned more than once? But we know specifically about one account. When was that, and where was that? Lystra. And when did that take place? On his first missionary journey. So that makes me wonder. I don't know. Paul doesn't know either, apparently, the details of it. But it makes me wonder, okay, when he was stoned, did he die? And did this experience happen then? I don't know the answer to that. But that would have been that time frame, if it's 14 years ago, on his first missionary journey. They thought he was dead. Or they thought he was certainly going to die. In either way, they left him there, supposing him to be dead or taking his final breaths. I don't know. Cause more problem, and maybe it's a possibility, and maybe that plays into why he's speaking in the third person here. But I'm just not sure exactly. Anyway, I just thought that was an interesting possibility that fit the time frame of that 14 years ago, where Paul was either left for dead or did actually die. Did this occur then? And I don't know the answer to that. It's just interesting to think about. What are the questions, comments? Well, then we'll talk about this third heaven. All right, so Paul doesn't know exactly what happened, but things are being revealed to him. He says at the end of verse 2, "Is such an one caught up to the third heaven?" All right, what is Paul talking about? He doesn't know if he's in the body or out of the body, but he's caught up to the third heaven. What is that? Well, it's been described how you can say there are three heavens, and really, I think it's possible that you might even say there are four heavens, and we'll mention what I'm talking about. What is the first heaven? What would that be? Okay, the sky, the atmosphere, all right? Where the birds fly, sometimes we say. What would be the second heaven? Outer space, where the planets are, the stars and the planets are. Okay, so outer space, the universe, so to speak. Now, you got the third heaven, and I mentioned the possibility of the fourth heaven. I think it depends on your perspective. And, well, let's kind of connect this down a little bit. He said he calls it the third heaven in verse 2. Where was he caught? In verse 4, where does he say he was caught up to? Paradise. Okay? And I think it's biblically consistent to make a distinction between a place we call paradise and the eternal abode of God. What do I mean by that? Yeah. And that's illustrated for us in Luke 16. It's interesting that Luke 16 doesn't use the word paradise, but I think the concept is there. Remember when you had the rich man and Lazarus, and they both die? The rich man lifted up his eyes, and where was he? Yeah, he was in a bad place. He says he lifted up his eyes in torment. But Lazarus was carried by angels into Abraham's bosom, and there was a great gulf between those two places, and we call that place where Lazarus was paradise. Yes. They told the thief what? Today you'll be with me in paradise. So you connect those two together, and even though Luke 16 doesn't use that term, you connect those two together, it looks like the waiting place, or the spirit, in other words, waiting place for judgment. When people die, they go into either the side of torment or the side of paradise in the Hadean realm. The spirit, not purgatory. That's a different concept. It's not biblical. The Bible doesn't talk about that, but it does talk about this place where the dead spirits are, and there's a place of torment. And we'll look at that. Let's Luke 16. Maybe we can talk about that in more detail another time. And what's the passage where Jesus referenced today will be with me in paradise? Luke 23? Oh, anybody happen to remember? I think it's Luke 23 something. Okay. Let's go double check it real quick. Luke 23:40. Thank you. Yeah, he's talking to the penitent thief beside him on the cross. And that would be the place when they died, they were in paradise, which logic tells us that would be the same place where Lazarus was in Luke chapter 16 when he died. And it's called Abraham's bosom there, in a place of comfort. They're in. Yes. Go ahead. Yeah. Good point. Very good point. You make that connection there. He had been to paradise, but he had not been to the final abode where the Father is dwelling. Great point. So now, getting back to the question about the what's the third heaven, depending on your perspective, some say, well, it's the abode, the final abode of God, but it might not be. It might be this place of paradise, which is the waiting place of the dead. So there might be actually 4 heavens, so to speak, because Paul refers to it in verse 2 as the third heaven, and in verse 4 he calls it paradise. So that might be that Paul went to this waiting place of the dead, which would also be consistent with the possibility of maybe this was not a bodily experience. Maybe he had actually died and went to paradise for a short. I don't know. I don't know the answer to that fully, but that's a possibility. What questions, comments do you have? All right, now, going into verse 3, he basically repeats what he had just said. He said, I knew such a man, whether in the body or out of the body, I cannot tell. God knows. So he's reinforcing, I don't know exactly what happened here, but there was a very special event that took place with this man, probably Paul, as he's describing in the third person. But other people don't have experiences like this. This was something very significant to him. But also reminder of why Paul's describing this. He's showing that he is who he claimed to be, and he's things have been revealed to him by God that other people have not seen or heard. Questions, comments? Verse 4. We referenced this a moment ago, but let's read it again. How that he was caught up into paradise and heard unspeakable words which it is not lawful for a man to utter. Literally it's not legal for someone to utter these words which Paul heard while he was there in the third heaven / paradise. I get the impression that Paul knew what was said. Paul heard those words. It wasn't something that was a mystery to him. He heard what was said. He understood what was said, but he could not repeat it. You wonder what that was? I do. But apparently it's not for us to know, not just yet anyway. I don't know of any occasion where Paul up into heaven came back and revealed it at all. How where God gave revelation or visions like to John. Right. Mm-hmm. John wasn't called up into heaven, which makes me think
these so-called prophets that claim they were caught up into heaven, such as Muhammad, who went up into heaven and he saw all these things and revealed it all. Mary Baker Eddy, who claimed that she was called up to heaven and she saw the Ten Commandments and halo around the one, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy, came back and revealed this. This tells me that if that had ever happened, why wouldn't Paul be able to reveal
exactly.
what he saw? So all these false prophets then that claim that they were called up into heaven, I think this verse would refute.
Absolutely.
We have these people who claim they have an out-of-body experience in heaven.
Paul didn't even know what exactly happened, and he certainly couldn't repeat the things that he heard there. So you're exactly right. Valid point that shows some very strong inconsistencies and with the claims that are being made today with those who claim to have similar experience to what's being described here. You have to tell you all about it and repeat what was said and so forth. Paul couldn't do that. Said it was unlawful, not legal for him to do such. Not allowed to repeat it. Then in verse 5, what other questions about verse 4? Comments? Then going into verse 5, of such an one I will glory, yet of myself I will not glory, but in mine infirmities. Paul's, in a sense, he's glorying, he's boasting about being granted this taste of heaven, or as he's describing it, knowing a man who was granted this small taste of heaven or paradise. Most likely Paul himself, but he will not boast of things that as if he did this himself. He'll boast of the sufferings that he had, his own infirmities and his own weaknesses, but he's not going to boast of, look at me, look what I've done. That's not who he is, and he's also recognizing the things that he's done were not of himself, it was because of the Lord. So lots of questions about what exactly happened here, and we just don't have all the answers. But Paul is telling him, keep in mind the reason that Paul is describing this. He's not just look at me, it's trying to show his accusers and those questioning him who he really is and the evidence that he really is a messenger of God, an apostle of Jesus Christ. Questions, comments? All right, let's read beginning at verse 6 now. We'll go down to verse 10. For though I would desire to glory, I shall not be a fool, for I will say the truth, but now I forbear, lest any man should think of me above that which he seeth me to be, or that he heareth of me. And lest I should be exalted above measure through the abundance of the revelations, there was given to me a thorn in the flesh, the messenger of Satan to buffet me, lest I should be exalted above measure. For this thing I besought the Lord thrice, that it might depart from me. And he said unto me, my grace is sufficient for thee, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. Most gladly, therefore, will I glory in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. Therefore I take pleasure in infirmities, in reproaches, and necessities, and persecutions, and distresses, for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then I am strong. I'm going to pause there. All right, going back to verse 6. For though I would desire to glory, I shall not be a fool. Paul does not want his boasting to be misunderstood, very similar to what we just said. He doesn't want his boasting, his glorying, so to speak, to be misunderstood as lifting himself, aggrandizing himself, making himself appear greater than he should, or what should be, or how he should be viewed. Is that if I'm tempted to boast in vain, to lift myself up, I'm going to resist. I'm not going to do that. That's not the purpose of what he's describing here, just to lift himself up. And also he says, I forbear. I'm going to resist that. I'm not going to do that, just to lift myself up. Why? Lest any man should think of me above which he seemeth to be, or that he heareth of me. He doesn't want to lift himself up and have other people think of himself more highly. That reminds me of other things that Paul said about these sorts. Somebody read for us Romans 12, verse 3. Romans 12, verse 3.
For by the grace given me, I say to every one of you, do not think of yourself more highly than you ought, but rather think of yourself with sober judgment in accordance with the faith of God, faith God has distributed.
All right, thank you, ma'am. So think of yourself with sober. What does that mean, sober judgment? Realistically, with a clear thinking, a clear mind, recognize who you are versus who God is, and don't think of yourself more highly than you ought to. Now, Paul is reminding in Romans there, Paul is reminding other people to do that. I think he's describing a similar thing, what he's striving to do over here in 2 Corinthians chapter 12. He doesn't want to lift himself up and make himself look and have other people even look at himself more highly than they ought to. That's not the purpose of what he's doing here. Also, let's read 1 Corinthians 10, verse 12. 1 Corinthians 10, verse 12, he says, "Wherefore let him that thinketh he standeth take heed lest he fall." Now, someone who is like Paul, an apostle, someone largely respected, although some of these brethren in Corinth were beginning to question who Paul really was. In general, we got a man who's highly respected and admired and so forth. What might there be a temptation to do? To brag and look how great I am, and I'm doing this all on my own. Look how great I. Okay, but earlier, as we described in the previous letter, 1 Corinthians 10, verse 12, let him that thinketh he standeth. In other words, you think you're standing on your own, that you're sufficient in yourself, what's going to happen? You're going to fall. So Paul had described that previous, and I think the same concept is being presented from Paul himself, reminding them why he's describing his experiences, why he's describing some of the things that he suffered, and the visions and revelations, as he calls it in verse 1, not just to lift himself up, but to defend against his accusers. Questions, comments? He doesn't want to boast in vain. He's refusing to do that, but he needs them to know and be certain of who he is as an apostle of Jesus Christ and how he spoke the truth of Jesus. Now, go into verse 7. "And lest I should be exalted above measure, through the abundance of the revelations, there was given to me a thorn in the flesh, messenger of Satan, to buffet me." So, to help Paul from being lifted up, to help Paul from viewing himself more highly than he ought to, he was given a thorn in the flesh. Now, the question is often asked, what is that? What's Paul's thorn in the flesh? And I'll tell you what it was. It was a messenger of Satan. That's what it was. We're not given much information about what this might be, but there's a lot of different ideas. But Paul had been given many revelations, and not just the one he just described as being taken in the third heaven. He'd been given many revelations, and things have been revealed to him prior to that even. And he's being inspired right now as he's writing. This thorn was given to him that he would not be too exalted or think of himself in an exalted way, apparently. That's the implication of why he had this, or why the Lord allowed that to continue, is whatever this thorn in the flesh was. The false teachers were exalting themselves. And Paul is striving not to exalt himself, but to exalt the Lord through what the Lord had enabled him to do. But pride can be a problem. Even the Apostle Paul had to be on guard against pride. And those who were accusing Paul, those who were teaching things inconsistent with the new covenant teaching, they were guilty of lifting themselves up. I mean, that's, to me, it seems to me that's one of the main reasons false teaching exists. Pride. Lifting up self. Here's what I think. This is better. What I think is better than what you think or what's written in the text. That's pride. That's what that is. That seems to me to be one of the main reasons that any false teaching exists. Lifting oneself up and someone's own opinion up over someone else's and also over what the Word of God clearly teaches. Go ahead. I think, well, he'd been giving other types of evidence and things that people knew about, could see in his life, the sufferings that he had gone through and so forth. But now he switches gears. As he said in verse 1, all right, there are other things that show who I am too, that maybe he can't just, they can't, they could touch a scar on his back and they could prove that to him. But he's given some other things. Yeah, it looks that way. Even though maybe he couldn't give physical evidence for the other thing, these visions and revelations. But it was additional things that had occurred, so he wants to mention them.
Also, and I'm glorying not in my own ability. The very fact that he was called up to the third heaven and saw things, he didn't do that. God did that for him.
Yep.
He said, "Of such a one will I glory."
Exactly.
He said, "God forbid that I should glory save in the cross of Jesus Christ." Always something beyond his own ability. I will glory in my infirmities, that which I'm not capable of.
Yeah, my own weaknesses.
So it looks like glorify God. Judaizers glorify
Themselves. Exactly. Great contrast in the mindset between Paul versus the Judaizing teachers, false teachers, teaching them to go back to the old covenant. Huge contrast in the thinking and the mindset and the purpose of what they were doing.
Wonder how many of them, the false teachers, perhaps proclaim some of the same things, like Brother Billy was bringing up earlier. More modern false teachers claim that they've received a revelation from heaven or gone into heaven, and he talks about a man that really did go into paradise, but he can't say.
That's a huge contrast too, isn't it? There are a lot of stories that go around that we can't prove, and I just don't know all the answers of concerning those things. But we know that Paul couldn't talk about what he heard there. And in fact, he said it was not legal for him to do that. But this thorn in the flesh, called a messenger of Satan, now, although it helped to keep Paul humble and it served a purpose that benefited his work in the Lord, it says this is a messenger from Satan. That's an interesting concept. Now, Satan didn't want it to be for good, but apparently it was. Satan attempted to use it to harm Paul, to harm his work, but the Lord allowed him to keep that because it helped keep him humble and keep the right mindset in him. And in fact, the text says it was a messenger of Satan for what purpose? To buffet. That's not buffet, that's buffet, okay? What does that word mean? Yeah. The word literally means to strike with a fist, to buffet me, to strike him. Just a little side note here, the English Standard Version has the word harass, to harass him. Yeah, and the New American Standard and other translations have the word torment, there. Yeah. Yeah. It causes pain, doesn't it? It's a constant reminder that something's not right. There's a discomfort and a pain there. And this was something from Satan that Satan intended to harm Paul, but it's keeping him humble. What exactly this was, as I said a minute ago, there are a bunch of different ideas of possibilities, and one of those possibilities might be right, but I have no idea which one. But there's different ideas on what it was. But whatever it was, let it remind us that there's a need to guard ourselves against pride, because this thorn in the flesh helped guard Paul against pride, even though that's not why Satan wanted to give it to him. Somebody was about to say something.
That must have been noticeable. Paul may be referring to this again in Galatians chapter 1, 13 and 14, where he says, "You know how through the infirmity of the flesh I preach the gospel unto you first. My temptation which was in my flesh, you despise not, nor reject it, but receive me as an angel or a messenger of God, even as Christ Jesus."
Yeah.
So whatever it was, must have been something that was visible to others that could have caused them to not receive it.
Good point.
You didn't despise that. If this is referred to the same thing.
It's a very good chance it is. Good point. But this, as I said, it's a reminder. We've got to guard against. If Paul needed to guard against pride, if he was in danger of that and needed, and a tool of Satan ended up being used to help him guard against, okay, we need to take note that, okay, pride's a serious thing. We've got to guard ourselves against that. And go on. I think we're short on time, but real quick, verse 8. For this thing I besought the Lord thrice that it might depart from. Paul wanted this gone. Whatever this thorn in the flesh was, he sought the Lord on at least three occasions, thrice, he says, that it might depart from me. Take this away from me. Which, by the way, a little side note, pretty interesting. I know somebody else who prayed for something to depart 3 times and didn't receive the response that was prayed for. He received a response, but not the one that was prayed for. Of course, who am I talking about on that occasion? That's Jesus. Let this cup pass from me. Remember what Jesus said at the end of that prayer. Not my will, your will be done. The same concept here from Paul. He prayed 3 times, take this away from me, Lord. But did the Lord take it away? He didn't. My grace is sufficient for you. Of course, that's a reminder for us that just because the Lord doesn't answer the way we want Him to, doesn't mean the Lord's ignoring us, doesn't mean the Lord hates us or anything of that nature. And Paul on this occasion and Jesus himself are examples of that. That didn't get the prayer answered the way they were praying it. It's a reminder for us. The Lord still cares. And there may be a purpose that we don't fully understand. But I think also there's another lesson in this. Because Paul is praying specifically for a specific intervention from the Lord in his life to do something. I think there's a lesson for us. We should be specific in our prayers. What our desires are, what our needs are. And there's a difference between those things and what our desires and our needs are. There's a difference between those. Sometimes we blend those together, but there is a difference. And we should pray specifically for concerning those things. All right, well, Lord willing, we'll pick up there and continue at verse 8 next time.